In this tutorial, we are going to look at UV editing and kind of go into what UVs are. And we're going to look at one other modeling technique that we haven't discussed that allows you to do cutouts and things from geometry a little bit easier than some other things. And it's really so we'll take a look at that. And so the first thing we're going to do is I've got this simple camera start scene that I created, and this camera is, as I said, simple, right? There's very few parts to it. I wanted to create some geometry that was, somewhat complex, because what we're going to be doing is we're going to have to unwrap all of this to create something that we can apply textures to in a way that is reliable and makes sense, and doesn't smear or warp the textures that we put on it. And this is really crucial for when we start working with body paint, and when we start trying to apply anything other than just, if we take our normal material and just plop it on there, that may be okay, but a lot of things can change. So to start with, what we're going to do is we're going to take this side panel that has nothing on it, and we're going to add a little feature to this. And so the way we're going to do that is we're going to do something, we're going to use the knife tool in a way that we haven't previously used it before. So one of the things you can do with a knife tool is you can create a spline, and then you can use that spline to be the cut shape for the knife tool. And so it's sort of like a stencil. And so you could, bring something in from Illustrator, like a logo or something, cut it, and then extrude that from the surface of an object. There's a lot of different ways, a lot of different things you can do with it. We're going to keep it simple and just use a circle. And part of this is because I'm trying to show you the techniques to unwrap UVs without having something so complex that it's going to take forever to effectively unwrap it in a way that doesn't make you want to lose your mind, because you're just learning how to do this. So what we're going to do first is I'm going to zoom out just a little bit, and I'm going to go ahead and go to my splines. I'm going to create a circle. And this circle is too big and it's at the wrong orientation. So I'm going to change the plane from XY to XY. And I'm going to change the radius from 200 centimeters to 20 centimeters. Now, once I do that, it disappears, and that's because it's inside this model. And so the way that it works to use a spline to cut, so what we're going to be doing is cutting a circle in the side of this object. And the way that this works is that the spline needs to be just above the surface that you want to cut, and then you need to orient the camera in a way so that you get that cut right where you want it to be and on the surface, right? If I was to, rotate my view like this, I might have a really strange cut in the side of the surface, or if this, oval was offset or something like that, that could be problematic. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch my view to the right side. And, make sure that your view is on the right instead of the left. Just double check that. And if it's different, just go to your cameras and switch from left to right. And so I'm going to pop this open, and now I can place this wherever I want it. I'm going to set it kind of down near the bottom of the geometry. And then what I need to do is I need to make sure I'm in Polygons mode. I need to use my live selection tool. I need to select the object that I want to cut, so the body. And I want to make sure that I have in my live selection tools, I have only select visible elements turned on. So I'm only selecting this polygon, and then I just want to click once to select that. Now, once I've selected that polygon, the next step is to use the knife tool. And so I could either go into layouts and change to model, and then select the knife tool from down below. Or I could hit the letter K on the keyboard once and hit the letter K a second time to use the line cut tool. And then, if I'm on the Mac, I hold down Command and hover over the path that I want to cut. If you're in Windows, I believe you use Control to do the same thing. And you'll know you're on top of it when all those dots show up. Now, those dots are all the points that are going to be created when this is cut. And currently, I want to keep this simple. I don't want that many points. So I'm going to go back to my circle. And the circle, the intermediary points are set to uniform, and it's set to 8. I'm going to reduce that to 4. And yeah, it's not going to be, I'm going to have edges in my geometry, but I just want this to be a little bit simpler to do. So we're going to do that. I'm going to hold down Command again. I'm going to select the body, hold down Command while I'm over this line. I'm just going to click. And when I do that, now I've got 2 polygons. And so if I pop this open and switch my view, you can see the spline is the dark line. And then inside that, I now have 2 polygons. So I'm going to go ahead and delete the circle because I don't need it any longer. And again, you could create a text object and cut text into the surface. There's all sorts of things you can do with this. It's pretty amazing. And then what I need to do is I need to make sure I'm in polygons mode, use my live selection tool, select the body, and I'm going to deselect everything and then just select the circle. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to extrude this in to the surface a little bit. So I'm going to hit the letter D on the keyboard. I'm just going to press this in a little bit. And then what I want to do is I actually want to make, rather than just have this be a straight cut, I want to create a couple bevels. Now, with this, when you create bevels, you have to be really careful, especially if you know you're going to be taking this object and UV editing it. Because what can happen sometimes is when you bevel, and I'm sure we've all seen this already, you can unintentionally make your polygons go crazy and stretch beyond the bounds of where they are. And oftentimes, even if you don't see that, you have overlapping polygons. And when that happens and you go to UV edit something, you go to do a step called unwrapping or relaxing, it's going to give you this degenerate polygons error, which basically means you have points or polygons that are laid right on top of one another, and you need to go and clean those up. Now, it'll show you where those problems are. It highlights the polygons that are at issue, but it's really annoying to try and clean up and fix. And so, in this case, rather than bevel this in polygons mode, I'm going to go to edges mode, and I'm going to use the loop selection tool. So, we're going to be using selection tools a lot in this tutorial because you have to do a lot of selection. And so I'm going to be using the keyboard commands to do that. The other option to grab all the selection tools, I mean, when we're in model mode, they're down here, but we're going to be switching to UV edit mode eventually. And when we do that, they're not going to be available. So the easiest way to get to them is we can go to the select menu up here, and there's this little dash double line here. If I click on that, what it does is it pops out a little free floating menu of all the items. And so now I can either come in here and click loop selection, or what's even faster, because I have to switch between tools so frequently, if I hit the letter U on the keyboard, that brings up the selection items. And then I know the letter L is loop selection. But you can see, by the way, as soon as you move your mouse anywhere, that's going to disappear. So you just hit U again to see it. So I'm going to hit U and L. And I want to loop select the inside ring, and I'm going to hold down Shift and loop select this outside ring, and then I want to bevel that. And so, right, the modeling tools, I hit the letter M first, and I could go down and click on the bevel button there, but it's also the letter S on here. So I hit M and then I hit S, and now I've got the bevel tool, and I can just hover over here and click and drag. And again, right, if I bevel too much, you can see what happens, right? I'm getting all sorts of weird behavior on the surface of this mesh. We don't want that to happen, right? I'm just going to bevel a little bit. So, right, so instead of having this like hard edge on both sides, I've just rounded the edge of this object a little bit in both places. Okay, so now that I've done that, there's something else there's one other thing we need to talk about, and that is, you'll notice that I have this object set as the body, the lens body, the round button, and the square button. And if I hide the square button, you'll see that there's a hole there, right? So I actually created a spline, a rounded rectangle, or maybe I did a rectangle and I beveled the corners, I can't remember. But I did a rounded rectangle and there's a hole missing there, right? And there's this button here. Actually, I do remember what I did. I actually did a bool to put those two things together. And you'll notice, right, I have my lens body, right, is separate from the body of the camera, but they're lined up perfectly. If I hide the lens body, the same thing's true. There's going to be, right, a hole there. And I'm actually intentionally leaving this polygon that's floating here in place, because if we make this lens transparent, you see the inside of the camera, which we don't really want to do. We want to be able to have a material here that we can, right, make it dark and not so reflective, or not so visible. So how and why did I do that? So first, the why, or the how. The how is that I took these things and in this case, I actually extruded this from the surface of this object and then was able to extract it. In the case of the button, I actually created a cube, intersected it with this top surface and through a bool, and then was able to separate it that way. And so why did I separate them? I separated them because what we can do is we can apply a different material to each one of these objects, and then it very easily isolates this. And as we go through to do UV editing and everything else, we can then, when we're going to bake all of these objects together, and so we'll actually combine all this geometry into one again, but it makes the whole process a lot easier, and it's just a lot easier to manage when you do things like this. And so I'm going to show you how to take an object you're modeling and split the geometry from it. So let's go ahead and we'll just add another boxy blob somewhere on the surface. Maybe we'll pretend it's like the flash cube or something that's like right here. So we're going to go ahead and create a cube. It's going to be way too big. So let's go to our model mode, or our model mode. And then let's use our move tool. And to start with, I'm just going to scale this thing down into some sort of usable size for the feature we want. And I'm just going to move it over here. It's way too deep right now, so I'm going to pull that in and then pull this out. Right, I don't need a whole lot of thickness on this thing because I'm going to be just cutting it right through the surface. And then let's go ahead and make it a little shorter. Move it up a little bit, move it over a little bit, right? And we'll say this is going to be our flash. I'm not going to worry about what that actually looks like too much. And then I might bevel the corners a hair. So I'm going to go ahead and do the cube. I'm going to check mark fillet. And great, I'm just going to leave it with the default fillet settings. It has 3 subdivisions. The radius is 3 centimeters, right? This is clearly not to scale, but for our purposes, that doesn't really matter. And so then to unite this with the body geometry, I'm going to go ahead and go up and create a bool. I am going to pull the body in as one object and pull the cube in as the second object. And right now the bool is set to A subtract B, right? Which means I get this pit in there, which actually, might be the way I'd actually want to model this with, and then I could have another object in there and some reflective surfaces, but I'm not going to worry about that. I just want the extrusion. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to change my bool from A subtract B to A union B. And I want this to be high quality, and I want to hide new edges. If I uncheck that, I get all sorts of nightmarish edges instead of this singular polygon with a hole cut in it, which is what we want. We don't need all of these weird triangles on the surface of this object. Right, so I'm going to say hide new edges. We could do a Phong break at intersections. What that does is it basically means wherever these intersect, there's going to be a hard corner. It's not actually, if it's within the Phong angle, right, it does some rounding, and so it won't round it no matter what we do, but in our case, it doesn't matter. So we're going to unite this, and so then what we're going to do is we're going to select these, we're going to right-click on this, and we're just going to go to Make Editable. Right? As soon as I make that editable, what it does is it creates the body and the cube, right, which I'm going to call the flash. Okay, so if I turn the flash off now, there's a hole, right? These two objects are separate from one another, which is pretty fantastic. Right, so I'm going to pull these out of the bool so they can just be part of the normal hierarchy again, and delete that bool object because we don't need it anymore. So I've got the body, I've got the flash, I've got the lens, etc., etc. So what else? So the other way that you can separate geometry if you've, say, extruded it from the surface of another object. So let's say I actually want to take this surface and press it in to the object a little bit, and then be able to essentially cut that chunk out of the object. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to Polygons mode. I'm going to use my live selection tool. I am going to go to the flash. I'm going to select just this front polygon face. I'm going to hit the letter D. And I'm going to click and drag to pull this geometry back into the body of the camera a bit. Maybe it only needs to go in just a hair, right? Like this is, say, the bezel that goes around the flash itself. Right? So I've created this geometry, and now let's say, like, I know that I want this to be like, say, shiny black material, but this needs to be something else. It needs to have luminance, or there needs to be some other material applied to this so that it looks more like plastic or glass. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my loop selection tool, and I'm just going to come down here until I can select that loop. I'm going to hold down Shift and select that, so I have that internal polygon and these polygons selected. And then in order to extract this chunk of geometry from the greater object of the flash, what I do is I go up to Mesh, and I go down to Cut. No, where is it? Sorry, I go down to Clone, and I go down to Split. And when I click Split, it creates this flash.1 object, and if I turn that visibility off, what it does is it has split that geometry away. So there's two options, I guess. I chose Split, but if I hit E and I move this, I'm just going to pull this out, you'll see that it's still in there, right? Because the base object, when I split it, I'm essentially just creating a copy of this geometry in a new object. Right, so what I should have selected and should have said is, let's see here, is this, oh. Okay, I have no idea. Let's get flash.1 out of here. Let's use our flash, okay. So what I need to do is I actually need to go to Mesh and hit the one below it. I need to go to Clone and Disconnect. And what that does is it disconnects, I'm going to say okay, right? It's disconnected this geometry from the previous geometry, and now that it's disconnected, I can go ahead and split this. So I can now just say Mesh, Clone, Split. And so now I have flash.1, and I may still have that internal geometry, but if I go to Flash, and actually what I'm going to do is I'm going to put this back. I go to Flash, and hit Delete. Oops. So I'm going to go to flash.1, I'm going to delete those polygons that are there, and for whatever reason it just renamed it a weird name, but look, so there's, right, so now there's that hole there, right, so this is a separate object, so I can just call, this is flash.inset. I'm not sure why it chose to do it the way it did, but, alright, so that's another way you can separate that geometry, right, okay. So I've made those changes, and so let's go ahead and talk a bit about UVs, what they are, and projections, and all sorts of fun stuff. Okay, so one of the things I want you to note is I've intentionally deleted all of the little checkerboard tag, which is called a UVW tag, from the things that I created. However, whenever you create new geometry, it automatically, especially if you make it editable, it automatically creates a UVW tag for that object, which means it's created UVs for those objects. And UVs are essentially a set of vertices and polygons that determine how the 2D image that we use, the 2D texture that we use to put the color and all the material stuff on the object is wrapped around that object. And that can cause, all sorts of interesting problems. So in this case, there's these UVW tags. On these other objects, there's not, right? And whenever we create, like if I was to just create a cube, right, any primitive we create has no UVW tag on it, right? The way it understands how to apply the material is based on the material tag. So keep this cube here, create a cube, and let's change our layout to standard. And I have this material that's called red here, and you'll notice it's got this grid in it. And we'll talk about that grid here in a second, but I'd like you to apply it to the cube. Right, so we're going to apply it to the cube, and when I apply it to the cube, if I click on the material tag that's been created, you'll see that there's these different types, this projection, right? And there's UVW mapping, there's spherical, which you can see that when applied to a cube, does a really bizarre thing, right? This would be kind of perfect to apply to, say, a sphere, but not so hot for a cube. And you can see how these lines are distorted, right? This is a cube. This grid should be square. But go ahead and just look through some of these other options, right? Cylindrical, again, not quite the best option. Flat, you can see that this top surface looks pink, and that's because that's what that top edge is. The flat projection, right, is really only projecting on one side and through the object to the other side. And then all the faces are pink on the other sides because the pixel that happens to be at the boundary of this object is pink, right? So if I go down to cubic, then I get something that looks like the UVW mapping one did, where basically all six sides, all six faces of the cube have the same thing applied to them. And the way that this looks when you look at the UVs is that these six sides are essentially folded on top of each other, and so that projection is going through all six sides at once. You can imagine it as they're all transparencies that are placed on top of one image. Right? If I had like Bob Ross's head as a material, his head would be on each of the six faces as well. If I do frontal, what that does is it projects from the view of the camera straight down onto the object, right? This can be useful for certain things. And spatial is similar, but again, a little bizarre. And then there's UVW mapping, which in this case, because we have no UVW tag, is just the default cubic mapping. There's shrink wrapping, which is somewhat like a sphere, but a little bit different. And then there's camera mapping. And camera mapping, I honestly have never used for anything. So I'm going to go back to UVW mapping for this. And now let's go ahead but if I go and I apply this let's go ahead and apply this material to, right, something else, right? So I've applied it to the camera body, and I'm just going to go ahead and get rid of this cube and delete it. And you'll see that this is not what I want, right? If I was to try and apply text to this, or like, the name of the camera or some other surface details on here, they're going to be all sorts of warped and smeared, and it's going to be a nightmare. So what's going on? If I click on the tag here, the projection by default is spherical, right? And that's because there's no UVW tag for this object, right? And so how do we create a UVW tag? That becomes the first question that we need to answer. So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and we'll delete this material to start with. And let's select, and actually let's go ahead and delete these two other UVW tags as well. And then I'm going to go ahead and just select everything in my hierarchy. I'm going to go to the tags menu, and I'm going to go to material tags and set UVW from projection. Now, the other thing is there's some polygons that are selected here. I'm going to deselect every polygon by clicking off in space with my live selection tool in the mirror. Okay, so now I'm going to go to tags. I am going to go to material tags. I'm going to go to set UVW from projection. If I click on this, right, by default the projection type is flat. Frontal also works, but we can just go ahead and do flat for this. It doesn't really matter what we start with, we're going to be making changes to the projection. So I'm going to hit OK. And then with all of these objects selected, I'm going to go ahead and see if I can apply the material to all of them. If I do not get all of them, then I'm going to go ahead and continue. And flat is not going to work for us. I already know that. So what we may do is we may go ahead and change our projection. Oh, and for some reason the flash inset did not get or flash.1 did not get a tag. So let's go ahead and set this from projection, and we're going to go ahead and we could either do frontal or we could just do cubic. Let's go ahead and apply this material to everything else. Button and up here. And again, these are all set to UVW mapping, but our projections on these tags were incorrect. So I'm going to select all those tags. I'm going to delete all of that. I don't know what just happened, but I'm going to select all of these. Material tags. Cubic should be right. I don't know. There we go. Now, notice that you can have multiple UVW tags. So you can have multiple sets of UVs. Ideally, you don't want that because it gets really confusing. So I'm just going to delete the previous one and have this one. So now what I'd like to show you is what some of the issues are with just applying materials like this without doing any UV editing. And then we will stop, take a break, and come back to do the rest of this. So here's one of the issues, right? This is all the same geometry. And you'll see that this is being projected, right? You can imagine these being projected cubically, right? So there's one face that's projecting on the front side, a face projecting on the left side, etc., etc. So one thing you'll notice is that they are not uniform, right? These are stretched a little bit. They should be square. And these are squished a bunch, right? They're much taller than they are wide. Something else that happens, if we zoom in a little bit, is you'll see on this object, we're getting something similar where as this goes around this bend, because this is being projected straight down, right? This edge here, everything gets compressed and smushed, right? And this is the same thing. This is that side projection, but things either get stretched around the corners or they get compressed around those corners. And when you have, if you look here, right, this one's actually reasonably okay, except where these edges are. You can see that they get kind of sandwiched down in there and they don't look right. And if you were trying to paint this or apply materials to this, you'd actually have these weird seams everywhere, which isn't going to be very helpful either. And the same thing goes on basically every surface on this, right? You'll notice as well, and this is pretty clean, but right, you can see that the number 2 here is being smeared across the surface, right? Things are not looking the way that they should look. And so, it's reasonably even across here, but again, they're not uniform. And when you have that lack of uniformity, then in some places on your material, if you make your image so it looks proportionally correct on the front surface, anything you apply to the top is going to be totally distorted. And that's what we want to avoid. Now, we're looking at this as a hard surface object, right? A camera. We're also going to look at kind of how, we'll do another tutorial on how to unwrap a soft object. But this teaches us a lot about the process. And so we're going to start with this. So we've set everything up. We're ready to start pulling this apart. So we'll do that in the next section.